about reducing risk for your Azure resources.
Yes, thank you very much. This is my first time speaking here, like Jan Vidar said. So I have been part of the community for around 3 years or so. I joined during COVID times, so only online events and perhaps some in Trondheim, if the occasion is. So I'm based in Trondheim. Today we are speaking about reducing risk for your Azure resources. Now that is a quite broad topic. So the focus of this is mainly Azure RBAC and identity. How to, you could really name it how to implement least privilege in a practical manner. So allow me to share my slides. Let's see. Yeah, thumbs up. Okay, so today's topic is this, like I stated, so we can perhaps skip. First, a bit more about me. My name is Audun Solemdal. I am living in Trondheim, working in Trondheim. I run my own little company named Solom. So to put CEO at myself, okay, I guess it's accurate, but it's not really something I call myself, but I guess I am. So I would classify myself as an independent cloud consultant. I do a lot of work with Azure, all things Azure really. For the time being, I'm hired in at Miljødirektoratet, where I work on their cloud platform. So essentially anything that which needed to be done at the cloud platform, I'm usually part of it. So I am interested in learning about new things on Azure. So I'm always looking into previews, new preview features, and whenever something is announced, I'm usually very eager to try it. So today we'll be speaking about some new features and some less known features. So the main part, the first part, is the top notch here, common RBAC assignments and their issues. So this is not a new thing. We'll be speaking some about using managed identities and reducing their privileges. This is not a new thing, but it's something which a lot of people don't really understand how to do in a good fashion. And there are also new options there. More and more services in Azure support managed identity and scoping down permissions. Later we'll be talking about actually a quite new method. It's around a month old since it came out in preview, how you can limit owner permissions and user access administrator. So these are highly privileged roles to your subscriptions. I will look at how we can scope these permissions down more granularly. Then we'll have a look at, well, it's not a new feature. It's been a preview for around a year or so, but it's went GA recently. That is deny action in Azure policies. I'm not sure we'll have time for that, but the first two we should be fine. So I will open up for questions after each of the main sections. That's the idea. And note that the first section will be the longest one, the main topic of today. Okay, first a very quick RBAC recap. Azure Access is built on Azure Resource Manager, which in turn is built up of resource providers. Example of providers can be Microsoft Web, for your Azure Web Apps, Azure Function Apps, Microsoft Storage. That can be your storage accounts, your disks, compute, it's virtual machines for the most part. Then you have two planes. You have the control plane and the data plane. So in Azure you have roles and role assignments. These roles have definitions which grant them or deny them access to these four items. So actions and data actions essentially. For the most part, what we grant access to is actually the control plane. But as we'll look at later on, this can have some drawbacks because RBAC is something which is often misunderstood or not understood enough for many developers and many new users of Azure. Yeah. Role assignments can grant RBAC roles to principals, and principals can be groups, users, managed identities. So these are Entra ID now. If you haven't caught the notice, Azure AD was renamed to Entra ID quite recently. So Okay. So these roles can be granted to principals at different scopes, and they are inherited. So for a lot of people, the only thing they have to worry about are subscriptions and resource groups and some resources, right? And any resource can only be in one resource group, any resource group can only be in one subscription, etc. Management group is typically only the cloud platform team who has to worry about, but this can also be nested around 7-8 levels, I believe. So when you assign a role at any scope, let's say you put it at a management group and the subscription is inside it, that role will be inherited down to any resource under that scope. And up till recently, it has been quite challenging to do anything about blocking inheritance. It has been possible, but yeah, it was not really what it was intended to do. There has come out a feature in preview recently called deployment stacks, which look into this. This is not the scope of this video, but there is a great YouTube video by a Mr. John Saville on YouTube, if anyone is interested in looking into that, because it definitely has some good things about it. Okay. How do most people handle RBAC? This is a thing I see a lot in both large and small organizations, private and public sector. So essentially, someone needs access to Azure resources. Perhaps you are an Azure administrator of some sort. So dev team or whoever really is crying, I need permissions, and you don't have time or you don't fully understand what is needed. Okay, you try granting the developer team contributor permissions, and if they are still complaining, you grant them owner, perhaps on the resource group or a subscription, right? This is more common than I like to see. So what's the problem with this handling? Well, the contributor role is really the only reason why it's granted so much is because it's practical, right? If you just assign the team or a user the contributor role, they will stop bothering you and they will have pretty much everything they need for the most part. So this grants the direct permissions to the control plane in Azure only. It can grant indirect permissions to the data plane. We'll get more into that later, but if you look at the role assignment in Microsoft Docs, you'll see that it only grants permissions to the control plane. So the unfortunate access, which most principals don't have, included in this role, are some examples. For instance, to Azure SQL databases or servers, storage accounts, you essentially have a backdoor access into all the data, right? So past services in Azure often have, or I think most of them have, if not all, have a sort of access key, which is essentially an admin credential. And granting the contributor role here will grant any user is granted contributor at the right or wrong scope, essentially admin credentials into the data plane of the past services. For EAS, you can reset admin passwords, you can reset SSH keys, or you can run a command without even having to connect to the machine. I have a funny story about this. We had one member of our platform team who had set up some AD group sync on a virtual machine, and he went on holiday and someone needed access. I didn't know the password, nobody knew. I didn't want to reset it in case it broke anything. So what did I do? Well, I found the name of the group and I ran the run command because I had contributor. So essentially without even signing into the VM or not knowing anything about it, I could run a remote command through PowerShell, right? So in some cases, it's nice to have a backdoor, but once contributor role is perhaps one of the most commonly assigned roles to users, you need to start thinking about this, what it can really grant access to when you run in production. Contributor role can also grant create, read, update, delete on any Azure resource, essentially, unless you have resource locks or something of that part. And let's say if you use infrastructure as code, which perhaps you should, or perhaps you don't always need it, but in many cases, I find it very useful. Do really your users need all this essentially admin access to your resources if you're using infrastructure as code and pipelines, right? So the owner role is also only based on the control plane, but it doesn't have the limitations of what a contributor can do. The most relevant difference is the permissions towards the Microsoft authorization provider, which allows you to read and write role assignments to anyone in the directory. Remember, anyone in your directory, that also includes guest users. Guest users are added as easily as essentially a Teams meeting, I believe, if not a Teams room. So if anyone somehow at any time during the last X years invited someone to a Teams meeting, they are a guest in your tenant. Remember these people. And all these people can be granted anything if you give a person the owner role. They can also create and delete resource logs, which are often used to secure resources if they are really sensitive or really important. They are not deleted or modified. Resource logs have some drawbacks. We'll get back more to that later. And owners can also modify Azure policy. So owner is essentially the closest thing you get to, how to put it, super admin in your subscription. So a note on Azure DevOps. There are probably some of you out there who have this already. If you use Azure DevOps or Azure pipelines, I should say, and you create a service connection up to quite recently, it's quite easy to just press automatic and next, and suddenly your pipeline has everything you need. So what I just talked about, you should keep this in mind. Perhaps your pipeline only needs to deploy to a web app or a few web apps and maybe a storage account, right? But this automatic thing has a tendency to grant the contributor role. And if you don't scope that to the resource group, it can essentially, you have all these admin permissions I was just talking about at your subscription, while all you needed was to scope it to a resource group or a web app or whatever. So please look into if you have this, because you need to realize that anyone who can run your actions, or if some of your users get breached, this can have quite serious consequences, especially when it comes to deleting specific resources. Okay, so we talked about the control plane so far and some of its issues. As stated, nearly all PaaS services support using keys for authentication. The only one I can't think of which doesn't is Azure Key Vault. And what you often see is actually people use Azure Key Vault in the correct manner during using managed identities, but they use it just to gain access key to other Azure PaaS services, essentially, which is really a step you do not need. I will get more into that later. Well, we get more into that now, actually. Instead of granting permissions to the control plane using simple roles like contributor or owner, you should look into granting them access roles which grant access to the data plane, right? And for greenfield development, what we do with our new developers now is the first thing I do when we deploy Azure services is that I disable all these keys. These are not disabled by default, because I think if Azure disabled these keys by default, Microsoft revenue will probably go a bit down, because Azure RBAC is not very well understood at many to begin with. So they would say Azure is too difficult and they will skip on to the next cloud provider. But now we're going to learn together how we can make this more practical. First off, if you look at this diagram, I found it from Azure Well Architected Framework. The question I have is, how many keys do you think are needed for, let's say, this Azure API app to gain access to? Don't focus so much on the network, but focus more on the services. We have App Insights, we have Blob Storage, Key Vault, Azure App Configuration, Redis Cache, we have SQL database, right? All of these services support some kind of key, which can be granted, essentially is your backdoor, I would say, which can grant full admin access. SQL database has the password, okay? But the other ones are access key, essentially. Anyone want to guess? Okay. If you include preview functionality, I believe the answer is 0 or 1, right? And the one key, that will be app insights from the front-end application, because that will run client-side. I don't think a managed identity would work there. Perhaps if you run Node.js, I'm not a front-end developer by any means, I think you might get away with 0, because the code will run server-side. So the preview functionality is actually app insights. Recently, you don't even need a key there, instrumentation key. You can get away with a role assignment. Same with Redis cache. This is also a preview feature. SQL database. This has been run for a long time. Key vault you really have to. There are no master keys. App configuration the same. Blob storage, right? So what a lot of developers do, if you don't guide them correctly, obviously, is that from the API app, they will grant the key vault secrets reader to the key vault, and the key vault contains all the secrets: your SQL database password, your application insights instrumentation key, your access, your main storage account access key, right? But my point is, perhaps in this case, this key vault doesn't even need to exist, right? You can just skip that step. And how do you skip that step? First, you identify which roles your API will need. There is a really great, I can't copy this link, fortunately. Essentially, if you just Google Azure RBAC, you'll be linked to an article on Microsoft Docs where you can read about these roles. Most PaaS services in Azure now, they support some kind of data role which grants access in a more scope manner. And note that this is not just me stating, this is the recommended way Microsoft recommends, right? Granting access to the data plane directly instead of no access to main access key, which are essentially admin keys. So these roles are granted to the different services. SQL, these are two special roles. The SQL database, remember Azure SQL can grant, you can create users, but you can also create users from Enter ID. That includes users, groups, and managed identities. And you can grant these users access instead of using an admin key. And how your developers will then handle this is quite simple, actually, more simple than you maybe think. If you see this C# code example of Azure Service Bus, previously the code includes perhaps the connection string with secret. Perhaps you read that secret from a key vault, or worst case, you put it in your source code directly, and someone might leak it by accident, and suddenly you end up with stolen data or a unnecessarily large cloud bill. So everything you need to do after these roles are in place, remember, after, is just add a reference to the Azure Identity library, which is available in .NET, Go, Python, Java, and perhaps some more I don't know about, JavaScript probably. So you add the reference to the Azure Identity, and you just put an overload in the method. Instead of just simply providing the full connection string, you just provide the connection string without the secret. The syntax will vary a bit depending on service to service. Then you can add a new default Azure credential and follow us before. So we'll get into new default Azure credential very soon. Default Azure credential is essentially just a chaining of methods to see, do I have access to this service, right? So it includes things like, okay, do I have a managed identity which has access to this resource? Do I have Azure CLA? I am assigned it with AC login on my local machine, right? And in the end, if nothing works, then it will come up interactive pop-in. Please log into the service if you have access. That doesn't work, it gives up. So this means that this authentication method I showed you with new default Azure credential, you can use the exact same code on your local developer machine and in your production environment. The same code will work. The authentication method behind the scenes will be different, but the code can be the same. It's not necessarily recommended that you are being the same. remember, these are chaining, just trying all of different methods. So sometimes the method you think is going to be applied isn't applied. I experienced that on this Monday for the first time, actually, where essentially we have a pod in Kubernetes using, I expected to use the workload identity credential, but the developer had set up essentially Azure AD authentication proxy and had, which then used something called environment credentials. So essentially it used client secret and client ID. So that's first the startup. This workload identity credential was used. Then it fetched some secrets from a key vault, started in a new loop. Then you are suddenly switching from authenticating with two different methods. So these developers were struggling for a long time, figuring out why is this not working? I have all the role assignments required. So you can use default Azure credential in production, but I wouldn't really recommend it. And just to have clarity which credential is exactly being used. So workload identity, right? Workload identity means setting up federation to providers which have services not in Azure directly. It can be some popular examples for the time being are Kubernetes, GitHub, Azure DevOps. So your Azure DevOps pipelines or your GitHub workflows or your Kubernetes pods do not need any kind of secrets really to authenticate towards Azure resources. And that includes Microsoft Graph as well. Note that. So in our GitHub Actions environments, really there is no need to store any secrets in any kind of mean. There is no need to fetch anything from a key vault or secret store. Because essentially what happens is GitHub or Kubernetes or whatever service has a token, which you can set up trust to your managed identity or service principal and say, hey, my token is from GitHub. I am this and this repository in this environment. Please, Azure AD, can I have access to this Azure Blob storage, for instance? And Entra ID will say, yes, here you go. No secrets are involved here, apart from short-lived tokens. So, practical implementation. I talked a lot about roles and issues with the contributor owner roles. To make this manageable, I would strongly recommend that you use something like infrastructure as code and version control. Otherwise, it might just be a hot mess, to be honest. So your managed identities, i.e. your API app, should be granted the minimum roles. Minimum roles that you will try and learn, just use Google, and there is good guidance on this. Nearly all Azure PaaS services support this kind of authentication now, like I said. And inform to your developers, how can they switch the code? Because this is not really a difficult code change, right? This is just a few lines of code. That's all you have to worry about. What you really need to understand is the Azure roles and who should be granted the roles. After this is done, disable all the keys. This is not disabled by default, remember? So your Azure Server SQL Server password, it doesn't need to exist. Okay, it doesn't need to exist. So one thing is not using it, the other thing is not ensuring it doesn't exist at all. Same goes for any kind of key here. So suggestion, let's say you have a hub-spoke topology where you have perhaps 3 groups you should mainly use for your spoke. One you can call readers, contributors, owners. Doesn't necessarily have to be granted this. You could call it tier 0, tier 1, tier 2 if you want to. So the owners group will be reserved for the managed identity, which you can use in GitHub Actions, Azure pipelines to deploy code via Terraform or Bicep or whatever. Your web apps down here, it should be granted the minimum roles. That's what we looked at earlier. What's the least privileged roles, right? Reader role goes to readers, contributor roles. Okay, that's perhaps the toughest one because what your developers or admins essentially need. It can vary a lot. If you want to use a custom role there, or if you want to use PIM for groups there, or if you want to just assign any role they might need, that's up to you because user needs can change really. So it's hard to determine exactly this one. I'll be honest with that part. Okay, sample architecture. Let's say you have a GitHub repository connected with GitHub Actions, which manages two spokes. One is called NP for non-production, and one is P for production, project one, in the GitHub repository, project one. Managed identity is assigned to the owners group, which has essentially access to great resources. And also you should set up, of course, some branch protection rules so that not anyone can just, hey, I want this in production now. Please let me use this admin user, right? That's a bit out of scope of this presentation. Let's see. Okay. This went on a bit longer than expected, but do we have perhaps any questions for the chat before we move on to the second part?
Not really a question, but a comment from Anders here. When using default Azure credential, you may limit the allowed credential types by using default Azure credential option, and this way limit to only allow managed identities in production, for instance. So that's looks like a good comment.
Okay, I was not aware of that, so good information. Thank you, Anders. So yeah, this is fairly new. Well, it's not fairly new, but some of the Azure services are brand new, like this App Insights. I was just found out about it when I looked into it. App Insights in itself isn't the most sensitive thing, but if someone really wants to abuse your key, they can probably rack up your cloud bill quite a lot, I believe, because the ingestion key in App Insights is write only. Okay, I think we'll skip off to part 2. New ABAC possibilities. So we talked about owner permissions, user access administrator, and access to the Microsoft authorization plane. Essentially, these roles can grant access to any users in your directory, right? And say you have a hub spoke topology, perhaps you need some people to grant Azure RBAC roles. You want to delegate this permission, but you don't want them to just be able to assign any role to anyone, right? So what's now in preview for a bit over a month is actually quite some good improvements on limiting this. I have some Terraform code at this link. I think we'll just show a quick demo. Yeah, let me see. Not questions yet, sorry. So first, let's look a really quick look at the code. This is available on GitHub, like stated. So ABAC isn't really something new in Azure rollback assignments. It stands for attributes-based access control, I think so, yeah. But previously, it was only working with Azure blob storage or storage accounts. So you could limit essentially based on, is this and this blob has this attribute, you do not have access, else you have access. Now what you can do is you can say things like, okay, you have owner permissions, but you can only grant these roles listed here to this group listed here, right? So previously, this is unscoped, meaning that you can grant any role to any user if you have user access admin or owner permissions. Well, now you can scope this down to essentially only the things which should be needed, right? And that includes service principals too. It's not included in this example, but you can click this through the portal. That being said, this is a bit advanced case, but if you take a look in the Azure portal. So here we are in my test spoke, which was in the diagram before. Let's see, is this my admin user? Okay, no. So what I've done here is this role assignment we show in Terraform. I granted users access administrator to this group, which includes my test user. If we skip to my test user and I try to add a role assignment, let's see, I want to grant owner, skip to here actually, owner to some random group because I'm malicious or my account has been breached or whatever. I can press next, and you have the same option in the portal as you see it, delegation type, constraint, not constraint. You press next. Sorry, not constraint. If I try now, it fails, right? It says something in the manner of, let's see, I have an ABAC condition to perform a role assignment over this scope. Or no, the ABAC condition is not met, sorry. But if we try something like, I believe it was storage queue, was it? Queue data reader, that was in the allow list. And I could grant it to, let's see if I remember, I think it was contributors. That's it. Does that work? It works. So this is a preview functionality, but I think it's quite good already. You can edit these assignments in the portal as well. It's perhaps more intuitive than Terraform to begin with. So this is a more advanced scenario. You know, if you just want to, you can press between visual and code. Sorry. Even just simple scenarios through the portal can be beneficial here, to be honest. Just assign, okay, this user can't just assign owner or user access administrator to anyone. Because, yeah, you're not sure where that might end up. Okay. Where did my presentation go? Sorry. Okay, are there any questions to this? I see we are going a bit over time, so let's see. Do we have any questions from chat? Martin asks, do you know if the scope assignments essentially use custom roles? I don't think so, to be honest, but I have not looked into that. I do not believe so, but I can't say for sure. Again, this is quite new functionality. I think I found it the same day it was released, actually. I couldn't even find documentation on it. So I would say this is already quite good, beneficial compared to today's situation, but you might be standing on your own for these kind of questions for now, I think. Okay, I don't think we have time to go into the Azure policy, unfortunately. But I can state this code is also on GitHub, and what it has to do is that besides RBAC, you now have a method to ensure that your Azure resources aren't deleted in any way. Up to now, you have been able to use Azure resource logs, right? But Azure resource logs have some problems that they are inheritance-based, and nested objects in Azure, this can be quite a nightmare. You can try setting up a resource lock on Azure SQL Server, for instance, and it will be inherited to all your databases, essentially. Deny action does not care really about parent resources apart from resource groups. So if you have some central cloud infrastructure that you really never want deleted under any case, perhaps your central Azure firewall or your central web application firewall, or perhaps an IP address which you use for a NAT gateway or outbound connections to third parties. These things are deleted, they can create quite a bit of hassle. Another example is long-term retention SQL backups. So remember, Azure SQL servers, if they are deleted, long-term retention backups will still be in place, but a contributor can really delete these backups too. So if you got a contributor to a user which has permission over your production resources, and that includes a SQL server, well, they are compromised. They might be able to delete your entire SQL server, your databases, and your backups. And all you can do then is contact Microsoft and save a little prayer that they have some backup. Or you can try using deny action. It's up to you. Okay. We can take any questions in the total for any section now, I think. We're on a bit longer than I thought, but questions regarding any section?
Thanks, Audun. I think we have one comment slash question from Kjetil. Yeah, it seems to have permission management in a little bit of scale. So I think the question boils down to if you would suggest any improvements with RBAC or Azure ABAC, what would it be?
Okay, I'm looking at the question now. I think it's a bit long, and if I look
Yes.
at the diagram, I'm a bit.
Yeah, I think it's.
I think I can try to look at this.
Yeah, if you have the possibility to come on off unmute, Kjetil, you can explain a little bit if you have that possibility.
We don't have time to go into details here, but if anyone has any suggestions on making the sort of new kind of concept for more dynamic security, that would be really, really nice. Just put it in the chat.
Okay. Yeah. So I think this requires some a little bit afterthought. But if anyone has some suggestions or tips for a dynamic way to work with this, you can put it in the chat, as Kjetil says. Yeah. Yeah, I don't think we have any other questions.
So remember, guys, if this presentation was quick and filled with info, look into the basics first, because this is not really an introduction level course to RBAC. That being said, so don't be discouraged if this was a bit advanced.
So we will. You can send me the slides, Audun, or if you are using GitHub, you can probably do a pull request and add it to our meetup.
Yeah.
At our MVP-dagen. Sorry, not MVP-dagen. That was yesterday. Now we're mixing up here. We have a Azure user group, have a GitHub account, so you can do a pull request there and put the presentation there yourself, and we will approve it, or just send it to me and we will share it after together with the recording, which also will be uploaded to the YouTube channel. So with that, I think we can just finish up with yes, a good comment from Anders. Use access packages with the PIM for self-service access with access reviews and approvers. So then you need to build kind of an access a catalog of a service that you would like to have pre-approved for permissions connected to roles, for example. Yeah, that's a good comment. Well, yeah. I think with that we can say thank you, Audun. That's great to share your thoughts on reducing risks for Azure resources using the right thinking of RBAC and ABAC.
Yeah.
So thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah. See you.
Bye now.